welcome to the Summit of Grace. And today we have a wonderful guest, Dr. Gary Sibcy. And I met Dr. Sibcy at a conference that he was doing. It was an attachment-based intervention certification training. And thank you for joining us, Dr. Sibcy. Could you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and about your work?
Sure. Well, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I teach at Liberty University in the School of Behavioral Science, and direct the PsyD program in clinical psychology, and then work in private practice as a clinical psychologist here in Lynchburg, and I work with a lot of adults and teenagers and children and families, and attachment is a part of a framework of meaning and understanding people's problems that I've written about and talked about for about 20 years now.
Wow, 20 years. And I think, a lot of people, it was new to me. This information was new. So I think it's going to be very enlightening for our viewing audience. So could you give our audience, our listening audience, just a brief overview of what attachment is, like the attachment styles that you speak about?
Well, so understanding attachment, really the simplest way of understanding attachment is recognizing that, God made us such that, we come into the world and our brain is not actually wired for how to do a lot of different things, but like how to calm ourselves down, how to deal with our emotions, and sort of how to even problem solve and interact with other people, right? So it's in the closest relationships that we have, the attachment relationships, that then our brain is going to learn how to do these things based on the quality of these interactions. And so we need relationships because that's how the brain wires itself, is based on these. So a really important thing is to recognize that attachment is about what's called secure-based relationships. And a secure-based relationship means that children use parents as a secure base. So when you think of young children in the first couple years of life, what happens is that they need the parent to provide a basic sense of felt security. So when kids feel secure, right, then they launch into exploration stage, right? So if you imagine a 1-year-old in a room with a mom, a strange room with toys on, all that in it, and they walk into this room, at first the child's going to kind of sit close to her, right, secure base. But once he feels secure, then he's going to kind of launch out into the room and sort of explore it, right? And he uses her as a secure base, but he's exploring the world, okay? And the parent supports what they're doing, and they delight in it. So it's an interesting way in which a parent is delighting in the child's autonomy and individuality while they provide support. Now, if something is threatening, right? So if a stranger walks into the room with a 1-year-old, or if the parent gets up and leaves, then this is going to create threat. Now, when a child experiences threat, then exploration turns off, right? They're no longer interested in exploring the world. They turn that off, and that turns on the attachment system. So then they're on the bottom of the circle. Now they're coming back to the parent, and they're signaling to the parent that there's a problem, right? And the parent reads this signal, right, and responds to it. They help the child sort of get back to your base, right? And so it's here on the bottom that the parent serves the role of organizing the child's emotions, right, and even delighting in the process of being able to play this role and to help the child get calmed down and figure out what went wrong. So there's a lot of things going on in this circle, right? It happens thousands and thousands of times in the first 4 or 5 years of life. And there's a couple important things. One is that when the child's on the top of the cycle, right, on the top of the circle in the exploration phase, this is where their beliefs about themselves are formed, right? Their their sense of self-esteem and self-assurance and self-confidence form when they're on the top, right? When they're on the bottom, that's where they start to shape these beliefs they have about others and their availability and their reliability and accessibility, right? So the child is asking, am I capable of, taking on the world out there and basic sense of self-esteem? And if I'm in need, will they be there for me? Right? So your basic sense of other. Key to attachment theory is that all this stuff that goes on in the first couple years of life become encoded into the child's belief system. We also call them schema or internal working models. And they form the basis of your view of self and your view of others, right? So if you break that down, there's 4 categories, right? There's a positive view of self, a positive view of others. In other words, I can explore the world and, I've got basic self-worth, I'm lovable, and I'm capable of obtaining my needs, right? And others are reliable and accessible. That's secure attachment. And people who are secure tend to be okay with exploring the world, but they're also okay with intimacy and expressing what their needs are. They're open to their feelings, but also other people's feelings. And they're able to engage in intimate relationships where there's not too much distance, but there's not too much closeness all the time, right? So now, another style of attachment is a person who has an overly positive view of themselves and a negative view of other people. And by negative view is around attachment. They may like other people for different things. They might like to go do things with them and hang out and go fishing or hunting or play golf or tennis. But when it comes to the issue of, do I need you in times of trouble? They're going to be like, no, I just need me, right? So they rely on themselves and they don't trust really opening up with other people. And they have a hard time with intimate relationships. So their primary fear is intimacy, right? And that's avoidant attachment. And folks with avoidant attachment, can be leaders. A lot of people, like for example, physicians maybe, have avoidant attachment at one level, right? Because they're very good at taking care of other people, but they're not good at letting other people know if they need anything, right? Now, typically, folks with avoidant attachment, what happened in early childhood is that their parents really promoted exploration, but when the child was on the attachment side and they were coming in, right, they were in need, the parents tended to shun them or reject their pleas, right, and kind of downplayed their emotions and told them, sort of get over it, suck it up, buttercup kind of mentality toward the child's emotions, and that's how that tends to get formed. Now, third style of attachment is where you have a negative view of yourself and an overly positive view of the other, right? And this is what we call preoccupied attachment. And what happens here is that the person doesn't necessarily feel comfortable in the exploration phase, right? They kind of have a hard time identifying who they are, what they want, what they believe, what they don't believe. Does that make sense? And they tend to be very more passive and dependent in relationships, or clingy, right? They want to be closer to you than you may feel comfortable. And a lot of times people who are preoccupied and people avoidant are actually attracted to each other in relationships, and then they get stuck in this pursuer distancer kind of pattern where one's pursuing and the other one's running away, and we see that a lot.
Yeah.
So those with preoccupied attachment have a hard time with anxiety and negative emotions because they feel really needy, and their primary fear is abandonment. So they're very preoccupied and concerned about being left or not having somebody to be there for them. Okay, and then the question is, well, what about the fourth category? The fourth category is what we call fearful avoidance, right? So sort of a negative view of self, negative view of others. There's a lot of anxiety about being abandoned, but there's also a lot of anxiety about intimacy. So these folks can, on the one hand, switch between being avoidant and being preoccupied. Sometimes they're really hard to let you in. They kind of keep you at a distance. They don't really get out and connect with people as deeply as they need to. But then once they do, once they do get in a relationship, then they flip and they become much more clingy and dependent, and are concerned about being abandoned. So that's the fearful avoidance, and those are the 4 styles of attachment.
So if you have a traumatic event, how can that impact the attachment? Like for me, like I was an older teenager, and my dad had said, and when you were talking, a lot of times my mom would say, "Shame on you," and my dad, so it felt like conditional love, that they loved me when I did right. So I was the
Right.
good girl. But then, my dad has said if I ever got pregnant, that he'd kick me out of the house and lose connection. And we are connected beings, and they were, my authority, my legitimate authority. They were the people I was attached and connected to. So, it wasn't all of the reason, but it sure, because, I had my pride, and I was at that place as a teenager, thought abortion, would ruin my life. But, that did have a factor, because I did believe him, and I could not see how I could survive at 17, let alone with a baby. It just seemed insurmountable. So, how can a traumatic event impact attachment such as that?
Well, so we'll talk about trauma in the early phases of attachment relationships, and then what can happen later. But you get this attachment secure-based system that we were talking about, right? Where when children are under stress, or when people are under stress, right, then they don't just run away. That's part of their motivation, is to run away from what's threatening, what's anxiety provoking, and they run to their secure bases, right? So in other words, the secure base is the solution to their distress.
Right.
Now, fearful avoidance, sometimes also referred to as disorganized attachment, this occurs when the secure base is also the source of the distress, right? So it creates this biological paradox where the secure base is both the source and the solution to a distressing event, right? This creates a certain amount of overwhelming stress to the attachment system, and some people can get locked up, or they can switch between styles, right? Or it can actually make if it's later in life. So if somebody that you really trust, really care about, really believe in as a secure base, and all of a sudden they do something that you can't make sense of, right? In other words, they become the source of distress, and they're also the solution to the distress, then that can create some disorganization in your style of attachment, of not knowing whether you're coming or going in close relationships. Now, a lot of times, the attachment styles that we see that carry forward into adulthood, the way that your parents parented you, attachment predicts very strongly that you will likely redo that with your own kids in some regard. Now, you can come out of childhood with pretty secure attachment and then get into relationships in your adolescence and adulthood and develop a different style of attachment in your romantic relationships. So your parenting attachment style can be very different than your romantic attachment style. Okay, so they're related, but they're not the same thing, because they're two different attachment systems. Sometimes people think of attachment as having, just one global attachment style that applies to all relationships no matter what. And that's not actually true. There's a parenting attachment style, or state of mind. There's a romantic one, and then we also have an attachment model that is forgot. So there's three different models of attachment that we work from inside of our brain.
So this is interesting. So many times we hear, my boyfriend wanted me to have the abortion. And so I had the abortion, but really didn't want one. So that would be the romantic.
That would be a romantic relationship where, right, this person who's supposed to be there for you and support you and be behind you, but then makes you do something that or threatens that the relationship's going to be over. I'm going to be done with you if you don't do this. And knowing that it totally violates your sense of morality or your sense of what you believe is right, but you feel, too afraid of what will happen if you don't do it, then that's going to create what we call an attachment wound. So that wounds the relationship. Now, will that change your complete style of attachment? Maybe not globally, but it certainly will likely change your pattern of attachment in relation to that person.
Well, and it's, the research indicates that a lot of times after an abortion, a relationship will either end or it will really struggle.
Right.
And so
and the same thing after miscarriages too, right? Depending on how the spouse responds to that. If they go, oh, well, we'll just try again, and they're not really, understanding and empathic and emotionally connected to how that affected her, then it can also be an attachment wound.
Okay.
So attachment wound is when you believe that your attachment figure fundamentally failed you, not in like they had a bad day, but you believe they have fundamentally failed you and betrayed you and let you down. That becomes an attachment injury, and it can begin to change the very nature of your relationship and your attachment style in that relationship.
And so the term with moral injury, what they're finding in combat veterans, the way they define moral injury, it's a betrayal of what's right by a person in legitimate authority or by oneself. I did it in a high stakes situation. So that attachment wound would be where that person that you attached to, that legitimate authority, betrayed you or let you down.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or like with fathers, because men are harmed by abortion, but we're not really hearing that too much because of the way they handle their stress or trauma. But when they've wanted to have the baby, or they see that they didn't protect and provide, then they struggle with the woman that they failed them. And so it's really difficult to recover from that.
Well, yeah, for the relationship to really recover, just because it feels like such a fundamental betrayal that when I needed you, the old song that, you left me just when I needed you most. This, there's one thing about somebody, letting you down. It's another thing about them letting you down in one of the most important and critical phases or events in your life.
Yeah, that high stakes situation. And what's more high stakes than a life or death situation with, your child in the womb, where you're so vulnerable. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are some things like clinicians and pastors and other helpers could keep in mind, when they're talking about or thinking about attachment styles?
Well, an important thing is, how each of them can present somewhat differently. So people who are secure are pretty open with being able to acknowledge what they're angry about or what they're upset about, but they do it in a way that's contained, right? They don't necessarily use a lot of blame, but they're assertive and they can be friendly. And a lot of times they're easy to collaborate with when you're working with them. So it's easy to develop a working alliance with people who are secure. People who are avoidant in their attachment, one of the difficulties is they tend to minimize problems, right? They downplay them. They don't see the importance of them. A lot of times it's somebody else who's having them come to therapy rather than they feel the need for it, or they feel really uncomfortable talking about their problems. And like I said, they sometimes downplay its importance. Uh, so for example, somebody who maybe had an abortion who feels really guilty and feels really badly about it may have a hard time actually acknowledging that they feel that way. They don't really trust in people, and that would include the clinician, that they're going to be able to understand how they feel, or that they're going to be able to, take it seriously. Whereas somebody who's preoccupied will tend to overwhelm the clinician or the counselor with their problems, and not only will they tell you how they feel, they want you to fix it, and they want you to fix it now, and you're not doing a good enough job at helping me get calmed down, right? And so, or they over idealize you and think that you're amazing and that you have helped them more than anybody in the entire world, and then you have to be wary of that, because it means it could go to the other direction pretty quickly. But then they want more time, they want more sessions, and so as a counselor, you can start to feel kind of worn out by them. And then say those with more disorganized patterns of attachment can actually have both sides of this equation. They may be hard to warm up. They don't really open up. They don't really discuss much about what's bothering them. But then once they do trust you, then again, they can become more clingy, more needy. And their tendency is they get so overwhelmed by their situations that they may engage in destructive behaviors as a way of calming themselves down, like cutting themselves, or binge and purging and those kind of things. So
Yeah, you hit on some things that when I do some take crisis calls, and it's just real difficult. And I can see a lot of what you're saying, and a lot of the people that have called. So another thing is, I hear that, and it happened to me, that after I had my first child, so I had a sonogram 7 years after my abortion, and I was traumatized because I saw a baby, which I thought it was, a blob of tissue. And so that's when my trauma had started. And then after I had my first daughter, I saw the preciousness of her, the beauty, and I felt like a monster. And that's when I started to have nightmares where I would save myself and let her die. And, it was just like, I am going to ruin this precious child. And it was hard for me. I mean, thank goodness my husband was so wonderful with my daughter right at first, because I was just scared. I was scared of this precious girl. And, what happened to me, I became, I was like overprotective. And I was one of those that wanted to be the perfect mom because of what I had done. And so I never lived up to this perfect standards, and always, I felt like other mothers, I compared myself to other mothers and wish I could be like them. It really, it was hard at the very beginning for me to attach to my daughter.
Yeah, so I can imagine that's not an uncommon experience for those who, had an abortion with their first child, and then, later when they, have their firstborn child, they really are, kind of paralyzed by this guilt, and it's very difficult for them to allow themselves to feel close to their child and to sort of emotionally bond with them. That can create a lot of, like I said, sort of discordance, where it's like, how could I have done this? So all the fear on the one hand of attaching, but also all the guilt and all that stuff that you had to reconcile.
Yeah. And, we did reconcile, but, I felt like, I lost a lot of precious years. And, it took a while for me to be just, 100% engaged,
Sure.
in my love for them. And one of the big things about moral injury that they're finding out that's different with PTSD
Mm-hmm.
is trust, because you don't trust yourself because you made such a horrible decision. I mean, and we've been talking at length about this, but one of the main things is you don't trust authority and you don't trust yourself. And so it took me a long time to feel like I can be trusted as a mother to do a good job.
Right, right. So yeah, the fear of trusting yourself and your inclinations and your decisions, and then also the willingness to forgive yourself, and to treat yourself with compassion, and forgiveness and restoration, to allow yourself to actually enjoy a relationship, right? Because people sometimes withhold from themselves pleasure and good things because they don't think they deserve them, which is a really powerful thing within the Christian frame of reference, is that grace is not something that anyone deserves. It's like we earned any of it. Grace is that something that you've obtained as a gift, and helping people to kind of move out of the you're going to somehow make up for what you did. Well, you can't. There's no price that can account for it. But like you said, you had these dreams that sort of indicated, like, I die for them to live. That you still get that sort of sacrificial sort of framework that's sort of built into the way that we think about justice, and what should or shouldn't happen to me because I did this.
Yeah. So I just want to let the audience because like there's some that actually feel guilty, like they had an abortion. They're like, well, I'm feeling bad because I'm not feeling as bad as other people. And when you think about attachment, how I see it, like with the secure base, you are developing resilience. When you have that secure base in childhood, you become self-assured, self-confident. You become resilient because you can trust people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would want you to, just to make sure that I'm correct. So the more resilient people are, the more they can get over things that, might be very difficult or traumatic for them. They may not be traumatized because of that.
Exactly. No, it's a really important point, right? So secure attachment does provide a basis for resiliency. So, for example, whenever something bad happens, to you, that's traumatic, for example, in order for that traumatic event not to turn into some kind of disorder like PTSD or depression, you have to be able to think about what actually happened and process it and make sense of it,
Right.
right? Because your brain has to see, like, what just happened, right? Like, if you're assaulted on the way out to a parking garage, well, see, we all have this basic assumption that the world's a safe place and that people are generally good natured and that, we're protected. Well, if you get assaulted on the way out to the parking garage, that shatters that assumption, right? And your brain is going to have to now make sense of what just happened to you. In order for that to happen, you have to be able to tolerate the negative feelings that come up when you are processing what happened and make sense of it. And if you really do believe that parking garages, for the most part, are safe places, right? You're not going to advocate that nobody ever park again in a parking garage, or, you think that you can go to Walmart and walk out to park. If you're going to ever return to that state, you'll actually have to go back out to parking garages and go into parking lots. And so you have to be able to tolerate negative emotion and process things and think about it. When you're insecure, like if you have avoidant attachment, you don't like negative emotion, so you do everything you can to push it away. Well, if you push it away and you block everything out, then you're not going to heal from that trauma because you're interrupting the normal flow that it takes. the same thing if you have preoccupied attachment. Whenever you start to think about it, you get completely overwhelmed and you get depressed, you have panic attacks, and then you have to cut yourself to calm yourself down, right? So that's what attachment does, for example, is it provides that basic set of skills that you have, that if something happens to you, you can process it, you can make sense of it, you can ask yourself, like, what went wrong? This isn't because I'm a terrible person or an awful person. Maybe I made some mistakes here, or I need to do this. But you can't do any of that if you can't actually deal with negative emotion and hold it and process it and talk to people about it and share it, but at the same time not overwhelm them with it.
Right. So important.
So those are the kind of things that attachment does. When we say that it provides resiliency, it does it because it's created these abilities or capacities that you need in order to overcome stressful events.
Yeah. And I've had many women say, that they can't even go there because once they start crying, they fear that they'll never stop. And so they don't.
Right,
so those words are, it's really true. So if someone is listening, and I wanted to ask too before we close, you also said spiritual attachment. Now with moral injury, there's loss of faith and spiritual struggles. Can you talk about the spiritual attachment piece?
Well, so in many ways, the same, just like parenting attachment can affect romantic attachment, it can also affect our ability to feel close to God, our ability to use God as a secure base, right? Jesus says, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy burden, right? That's an attachment piece that when you're under distress, right? Come to me, I'll be there for you. He's not saying, be anxious for nothing. So if you're anxious, it means you don't trust me. So, what's your problem? He's not doing that. He's saying, come to me, right? And that's an important, pattern of beliefs that can you experience God as near? Can you experience him as actually present? Right? It's funny in the Philippians 4 passage where Paul states, be anxious for nothing, right? Don't forget, just before he says be anxious for nothing, he says the Lord is near, right? In other words, your secure base is present. He's here. He's at hand. Be anxious for nothing is more about just sort of spinning around and around in worry, but in all things in prayer and supplication, make your request known to God. In other words, come to me, right? Bring it to me. And this is what gives one a sense of peace. Now, remember, peace doesn't mean that God always solves the problem the way that we want him to, right? In the same way that if you as a kid, you're sick, right? You got a stomach ache or a headache and you're sitting on mommy's lap, she doesn't make it go away, but the physical holding and presence that she brings to it makes it more tolerable. So God wants to not necessarily take away your pain and distress, although that would be great, but he also wants you to find that closeness to him in the midst of it, to find him in the pain rather than demand that he take it away or believe that he's not there for you when you're in pain. Yeah. So those are important pieces about God attachment. And the same kind of factors come to play when you're under distress. Some people beg God, right? Take it away, do what you can to take it away. And that's more preoccupied, right?
I did that a lot. Just take this away, but
right.
It didn't seem like anything happened. But, he was...
Right, and it kind of creates more distress, right? Because it doesn't work that way. God doesn't just take it away. And then the avoidant person is more likely to say, whatever, I'll deal with it myself, right? And they find other ways to deal with it, whether it's, maybe some habit or, pornography, or they find some kind of addictive behaviors to resort to, but they're not really going to, go to God in comfort when they're under distress. Now, somebody with avoidant attachment, by the way, may talk about how great and wonderful God is when things are going really well in their life, but it's when they're under duress that they turn from it, emotionally turn from it. They don't necessarily theologically turn from him, right? They don't give up their faith, but emotionally they don't really want to trust in God to be present in their pain. So that's how that works.
And I know that we're just scratching the surface to this. There's so much more. You put in many, many years working with this. But if someone listening to our conversation realizes that they have an insecure attachment style, what are some steps you would recommend for them to take? And then we'll close.
Well, so there's a lot about the insecure attachment style. And, first of all, you might want to measure your attachment. And if you probably just go to Google and type in ECR, and that stands for experiences in close relationship. If you type that into Google, you can see where it takes you to Open Psychometrics, a site that has a bunch of different tests that are legitimate. And the ECR is one of the most studied measures of attachment. And you can take it for free, and it'll give you where you are in the attachment spectrum. We don't really always think of it as 4 different categories. It tends to be dimensions, right? So sometimes you're more avoidant, right? You tend to move away from people when you're under stress, or you don't. Or anxiety is that, you tend to cling to people and want to be closer to them than what they feel comfortable. And so it helps you understand the differences of, where you're more likely to be situated. There's a lot of people who are secure, right? You could be secure, but with a little bit of preoccupation, right? Secure, but little preoccupied or anxious, or secure, but a little bit more avoidant, that kind of thing. So, but it depends on what kind of problems that these insecure forms of attachment are causing you, right? If you're avoidant in your attachment, sometimes you can feel hollow and empty on the inside, and you may not feel a need to be close to other people. And what you want to work on, if you're avoidant, is work on becoming more aware of how you feel and share that with people, and begin to, you're going to feel anxious when you do this, is to allow yourself to be a little bit more vulnerable and see how that goes, right? Does it make things worse? And if so, how? And what are you afraid is going to happen? The flip side is, if you're preoccupied, then the challenge is that it's not so much about sharing your feelings, it's more about becoming more independent, right? Instead of always demanding that people do things with you, try doing some things alone, right? I usually have people even practice a spiritual discipline of not just alone time, like, in your, sofa chair and having devotions with God. Try doing a solitude retreat, right? For somebody who's more preoccupied in attachment and they don't like being alone, and they would want to sort of stretch themselves to practice independence and solitude. And during those times, then finding God in those moments, but also learning to, be by yourself, have your own interests, your own hobbies, your own interest. So solitude doesn't mean you bore yourself to death. It means that you practice doing things independently. If you're in a marriage and you're preoccupied, it may be about developing more friends that are your own pals that you go do things with. So if your husband wants to go play golf, you can go, fine. Me and Sally are going to go, for a day trip to go do this, or we're going to go do that. So work on building your own friends. So those are some examples. You can't just change it by meditating or by willing it to be. Usually you have to change it through practicing certain kind of pinpointed behaviors.
Very good. Well, our time's out, and I just really appreciate, your insights. And like I said, I know we could probably talk all day and learn a lot more, but this helps us get started with attachments, and I just really appreciate your insights and your time.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we have a website, securebasedsystems.com. It should open up in probably the next couple of weeks, and we have a lot of videos and slide presentations and those sort of things in there that you can
Oh,
benefit from.
that's
So
wonderful. What was that site again?
it's called securebasedsystems.com.
Securebasedsystems.com. I'll be sure to check that out.
Yeah,
All
sounds
right.
great.
Well, Dr. Sibcy, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And back to the summit.